All right. Welcome, fellow druids. We're going to talk a little bit. Actually, surprised that I waited this long. I know I talked a little bit during the CID for this, but we're going to talk about Season 8 of Champ. It's not actually Season 8 of Champions, it's Season 8 of Active Duty roster, but remove this just a little bit. But it is Season 8 of the ADR and Champion. And ADR really only matters for Champions now. So I'm going to real quick talk about what has changed with Champions. Then we're going to go through Circle's roster of casters. And then we're going to talk about the broader picture of what's going on in ADR. So also, just if you're tuning in, if you've been watching for a long time, I'm trying something slightly different with my camera. So if it sort of is strange or throws you off or anything, let me know so I can adjust. Basically, I have my camera on a tripod. So my monitor's sort of at a different angle. So since I'm reading stuff from it, I may not be always looking directly at the camera. Anyways, aside. So real quick, the changes to ADR. Just as a brief mention, Masters is not going to use ADR. There will no longer be a rule where if you bring 2 of the 4 or 5, as the case may be, or 3, casters that are on the active duty roster, that you get some sort of benefit from Masters. Gonna real briefly talk about, I actually think this is a marvelous change. I know for some people are like, oh, well, Masters and Steamroller are the same thing. And in my head, I'm like, that's great. Really the only thing I would entertain personally as making Masters better is if Masters had painting requirements potentially and regular Steamroller did not. However, I think you want, at the moment, I'm more about events being inclusive to allow more people to play rather than making it exclusive to people who paint. I do like the hobby aspect. I think it gets kind of swept under the rug too often, but I also don't want the pool of people who are interested in playing to be limited. I think there's certain tournaments that should absolutely have painting requirements. The Invitational Lock and Load, the Invitational Ore Machine Weekend, WTC. I would even support a few more specific tournaments having those requirements, but I don't think for Masters that it needs it. Anyways, I think Masters being the, quote, pure format, the legacy format, if you will, is great. Champions, on the other hand, as always, requires players to use the active duty roster. In addition, the active duty roster, or ADR, is now both casters and theme forces. And we'll go over which theme forces and which casters, obviously, in a little bit. When you build a list for Champions, you have to play a caster that's on the ADR and a theme list that's on the ADR. Champions is changing to be a 1-list required, 2nd-list optional format, where before, I believe it was it was a dyad or triad, which meant you had to bring 2 or 3 lists, and it was DNC 1, which meant you had to play each list once. If you choose to take a 2nd list, however, you're going to have to pick a different caster, which that's normal, and a different theme force. So all these do have at least 2 theme forces. One exception has 3. And then finally, Divide and Conquer is being removed from both Masters and Champions, actually. So that is a fantastic change as well. So that's just a little bit of the changes. So let's talk now about, let's go straight to Circle's active duty roster. So we talked a little bit about this if you watch my video back when this was in the CID. And I was sort of intrigued, interested. At the time, there was sort of a debate as to whether or not you were going to be required to play both themes or not. And before I get too deep into this, I just want to make a quick aside, maybe a minor soapbox type moment, where I just want to say a lot of people have been like, oh, I don't like being forced into this theme. I don't think this caster makes sense with either of these themes. I didn't like Champions before that it was limited. Now it's limiting even more, etc., etc. Champions is intended to be a limited format. If you're familiar with Magic the Gathering or Hearthstone even, they have formats that they call standard. And those formats in those games are the most recent set or sets within, I think Magic is like 2 years worth of Magic. And that's a game that's been around since like 1993. And what that and same Hearthstone's similar, but it hasn't been around as long, obviously. And the intent of those formats, much like the intent of this format, is to reduce the amount of things that are present in it, to reduce the amount of mental overlap that you need to think about, to reduce, frankly, just a lot of I'm trying to think how I want to say this, to reduce just a lot of the overhead of the game. We're in a game where we don't want to actually retire models ever, and there's a lot of good reason for that. But that means it's really hard for new players coming into the game to be able to really look at Masters and adapt to it. Furthermore, even if you are able to do that, the intent of a limited format is to actually limit you. And contrary to what sort of a lot of people think, when you limit things, you sometimes actually increase the amount of creativity. Because now you're having to solve different puzzles and sometimes with different ways of getting the solution. And I think that goes missed by a lot of players often when thinking about limited formats. And Theme Forces themselves have done this, so I think there's a little bit of that as well, right? So how can I solve this problem of I need to deal with armor cracking, or I need to deal with this particular caster, or whatever the case may be? How do I solve that problem with the tools that I have available to me? And normally what you have is the full faction available to you, so you have a lot more options. But you also have a lot more problems to solve. In Champions, you're going to have a smaller number of problems, but also a smaller number of ways to solve those problems. Or a smaller number of questions to present to see if the people playing those can actually handle it. So, with that in mind, when you look at this list, don't even look the discussion of oh, well, this is just bad masters, or these casters are considered totally terrible. Well, that's in Masters. In Champions, they might not be, right? Maybe one of them isn't going to really be the answer that we need to the particular meta that forms in the 6 months of Champions. And we believe it to be 6 months still. But that doesn't mean that that the tools aren't there. If you're going to approach it and be well, this caster's terrible, and that caster's terrible, and that caster's terrible, so this format's terrible for this faction. That's not how this works. Look at what the casters do, what lists you can build, and what lists your opponents are going to be likely building. And this is going to be hopefully different meta than what develops out of Masters. Okay, so that was a little bit of soapboxing, but let's go over who's on the active duty roster and what theme forces are on the active duty roster for Circle. So in Circle, one caveat that we have is what I didn't mention was above, that all of the Circle all of the 9 factions that receive battle boxes will also have the caster from those battle boxes always be legal, at least as of at this time, for Champions. So for Circle, that's Tanith, the Feral Song, but for all 5 main War Machine factions and all 4 main Hordes factions, those casters will remain legal in perpetuity, or at least for the next year until we revisit this document potentially. So the first caster then is Tanith. Next we have Kaya the Wildheart. That's Kaya 3. We have Kruger the Stormlord, who's Kruger 2. Wormwood, Tree of Fate, and Cassius the Oathkeeper. And finally Morvana the Autumnblade. And that's Morvana 1. And then the theme forces we have access to are Bones of Orboros and the Devourer's Host. So immediately, the first thing I would say looking at this is, I know far too many players right now in the Circle faction are very hung up on the fact that they feel like Circle is functionally a mini faction that is just Bones of Orboros right now. And I still think that's a bit short-sighted. I understand why we're there. I've felt that way myself at times, too. When you look at the costs of the different war beasts in different places, it makes sense. So I get it. However, this is a different format, and regardless of how you feel about Bones, you're definitely going to play one Bones list here, and you're probably going to still need a second list, and that other list isn't going to be able to play in Bones. So you're going to definitely be wanting to look at what you consider with that. If you watch my video on sweepers and pivots, I think it's going to be really important as you look at this format to be considering that style of list creation as well. Can you, sometimes it's answer problems, sometimes it's, do I have this list I can windmill slam into certain matchups and just crush it or not? So with this format, I think you're going to see that the way the lists are constructed sometimes are going to play more pivot sweeper, but also the casters are going to. So as I look at the active duty roster, like for example, I'll never see Morvana 1. Well, I don't know about never. I look at Morvana 1 as a sweeper. And the reason I look at her that way is because she has an incredible set of recursion where she goes, can you deal with this unit never dying throughout an entire game and me really accelerating infantry? And if the answer to that question is no, like if you didn't bring RFP or just some massive way to deal with infantry, she's going to be strong. And if you did, you're going to want to go to your pivot. So that's somebody to keep in mind. We're going to look through some of these other active duty rosters, but she's definitely a model to keep, or warlock to keep in mind for this format, because she's going to be able to do that sort of thing. To a degree, let's not beat around the bush here. Kruger 2 is the strongest warlock we've ever had on an ADR. And Bones is the theme force that I think he plays the strongest in right now. His spell list combined with Geomancy is just phenomenal. He may end up tweaking his list a little bit here. For example, I normally bring Linus and Adrea with him, but I need to spend a little bit more time thinking about it. But in this format, I may not do that because there may not be enough considerations for Cloud Walls, because one of the biggest reasons that I typically play that is because of Kaya 3. I'm sorry, Haley 3. I was looking at Kaya 3 when I said that. And if there is no Haley 3 and a few of the other things, do I need to do that? I mean, maybe they're still okay at like holding his own and stuff, but maybe there's a different 5 points there that I can bring, or maybe I'm going to bring like a 3-point option and get a Gallows Grove back in the list. Wormwood is also strong, I think. So I'm going to kind of go over what theme I think each one plays in. Kruger, I think if you're bringing Kruger pre-CID for Devourer's Host, and just to be straightforward on this, I'm not expecting that CID to happen until possibly as late as after Gen Con. If that's the case, we're looking, and any day now, we're probably going to see the solicitation for September. I'm not expecting circle models to be on it, so that puts us at absolutely the earliest being October for the Tharn release, and possibly closer to November. So if that's the case, many of the Champions events that are going to be out there are going to be pretty much wrapping up by the time that goes live. So I would say approach this active duty roster with the rules as you know them now. So regardless of that, Kruger 2 I think is probably still going to play the strongest in Bones. Morvana I think personally does not play. Morvana 1 personally does not play really well in Bones at all. So I think you're looking purely at Devourer's Host in her case. For Wormwood, you could kind of go either way, in my opinion. I don't know that he's going to play the exact typical Devourer's Host type lists. I don't know. For Bones, he can play a lot of different lists. I haven't really been thinking about him a lot lately. I kind of got frustrated with his Crix matchup the last time I played him, but of course now their matchups changed a lot. And frankly, I was not giving him enough table time, and I think he's another caster that needs table time. But at least if you're playing him, well, I don't remember the list I was playing then. Kaya 3 she's the sort of oddball here. When you look at what she does, you pretty much immediately like, I'm going to play Call of the Wild. However, that isn't possible here. And you're like, well, Synergy is the money-making spell here, so I want a battle group of decent size. But if I play in Devourer's Host, am I going to get any of the benefits of the theme? And the answer that I have for you is I'm not sure. Her feat is very, very strong for Devourer's Host, and Fog of War is pretty strong as a delivery mechanism. But then, like, how many points you're putting into your battle group versus how many points you're putting into the Tharn, and it starts to get very strange. So I'm not super sure. She feels a little bit odd to me to be on this list. I feel like there's something there. So there's a few possibilities when we're looking at why certain casters made it onto the ADR. First of all, I dismiss this entirely, but she could play in Bones, right? The one thing she doesn't do is extend their threat, which Bradigus does. But in this format, if you need to deal the absolute most damage you can, you could bring the most efficient War Beasts and the most of them in Bones and still get advantage out of synergy. In fact, like, I know one or two people sort of offhand talked about the Wold Whites with her a lot, and when they were defense 13 in the CID, that would have been even better with her. There might be something there, but like her kit kind of wants to ramp up defensively, which also again makes Bones sort of an odd choice. There may be something there in Bones. I think if I test her, I'm going to test in Devourer's Host and look to bring, you know, either 20 or 40 points of Tharn, or, you know, very close to that, and use the feat, possibly Fog of War, and sort of make for some really awkward situations for my opponent, and then bring a battle group behind that or in front of it, depending on the situation. But the thing there is, you're looking at something where there's a few possibilities of why the developers chose to put her on here with this set of theme forces. One, they wanted to give people a chance to be creative, right? What lists is somebody going to come up with Kaya 3? What are we going to find there? Another possibility is that they put her on there as a skill test. You know, does she fit in these theme forces? No. You know, and that sort of limits what the way she's playing. I tend to lean towards the former, where I think there's some ideas that they have internally, or possibly some lists they've played and had success, or possibly some ideas they've batted around and they want to see what the community does with it. So anyways, there she is. And then there's Tanith, and I think Tanith can play in either theme. I know a lot of folks have liked her in Bones. Devourer's Host, she's not going to do anything defensively for Devourer's Host, but with Scything Touch and with Affliction, she can certainly ramp up some of their output. A Tharn Bloodweaver Night Witch, or a Whitemane, or really even the Ravagers with their Overtake, any of those type of things with Affliction can be incredibly strong. So with that, you want to sort of look and see what kind of infantry lists are maybe showing up, and what kind of lists in general, because if we start seeing things that are like high armor, single wound troops, then Tanith's value is going to skyrocket, right? And also she does have some control effects, which might be important. Shadowbind can be very key in some matchups. Generally, anything that doesn't have a lot of warjacks. So that's kind of what we have on our ADR. So now the next thing is, and we're gonna, you know, this video is probably gonna be one of the longer ones again. So we're not gonna go through a ton of stuff. I'm gonna highlight a few of the things that are of concern and not of concern. Or I'm just gonna try to go kind of quickly. There's actually a lot here. There's a lot to unpack. We'll probably get into some specific episodes as I test a few things and look at a few things. You know, different people are going to have different thoughts on how this goes. But anyways, to go over Cygnar, they have Striker 2, Siege 2, Cray, and Darius, and they're bringing heavy metals or Gravediggers. So and then of course they have Maddox. Maddox I don't think plays super well with these themes, but I don't know that means she absolutely won't play them. Striker 2, I think, can play. I think the most common pairing you're going to see is probably going to be Siege in Gravediggers and Cray in Heavy Metal. But I do think you could see Striker in either. I think you could see Darius in Heavy Metal. I think if you see Maddox, you're going to see her in Heavy Metal, which feels a little awkward for her. Unless Signar players learn that Sword Knights are actually not terrible. But don't count on them to do that. Yeah. So, with this, I think, depending on which... So, keep that in mind when you're bringing it. They're not bringing a lot of RFP. They're not really bringing a lot of the super long range, super ranged heavy. There's no Sloan here. There's no Kane 3 here. Or Kane 2 or Kane 1. You don't have any Haleys. You don't have any Nemos. And in fact, they have a lot more melee presence overall here. So be considering that. One of the things when we're building lists, a lot of times you're like, oh, well, what do I do if I get paired up against this super duper long range threat? Well, a lot of those are in Signar and they're not playing them. So that's probably, one of my key takeaways. They do have some of the longer melee threats though, so you're going to want to definitely consider that with your list building. Going down to Protectorate, they have the Faithful Masses and the Creator's Might, and then they're bringing Durst, Krios 3, Vindictus, and Severius 2, and then of course Malekith. I don't really know enough about Malekith. I think he's a little underrated. He does have a knockdown spell. He does have a feat that amps up damage. I think he can play in either of these themes. Krios is sort of the odd man out. I expect to see very little of him, just because most people I think are going to be too upset that he can't bring Vengers with him, which is sort of one of his main abilities. Durst is your standard pretty bricky armor. I think if you're going to see a lot of Warjacks, you could see him. You're going to see Severius. I think Faithful Masses probably goes to Vindictus, more likely. But we'll see. I do think Faithful Masses with Malekith probably has more potential than a lot of people think, and we may see that explored some in this environment. Keep in mind, if you do have him, one of the things that he does is brings his Jack, and his Jack basically means their whole list has Blessed. So that by itself is important enough for them to be looking at. Okay, going to Khador, they have Armored Core and Jaws of the Wolf. So Armored Core is the Manowar based theme. Jaws of the Wolf is the Warjack theme that I think includes Kayazis. And they have Butcher 1, Irusk 2, Sorsha 3, and Zerkova 1. This is an incredibly strong lineup. Really the one thing that's interesting here is I don't think anybody particularly is excited to play in Jaws of the Wolf. I think they can, and I think if they play that, you're gonna see the Kayazis, so you're definitely gonna have a plan for high defense, stealth, melee. High defense in melee, and then stealth as ranged. You're gonna want to make sure your list has an answer to that. If you're coming up against Khador, the other thing though is I think you're gonna see Butcher 1 or Sorsha 3 with Armored Core. You're going to see Armored Core. I think Armored Core might even end up being their main list, and that means you're definitely going to want to try to think of an answer to Shock Troopers. There are a lot of ways to answer them, but they can be particularly difficult for us as Circle. They can't be pushed, they can't be knocked down, they can't be slammed, and they go to armor a lot. I think as high as 23 with Sorsha 3. And Butcher's going to ramp up their output, so you may see like the Bombardiers with him. So it really depends on which way they want to go. I think there's a lot of strong choices there. I think Armored Core is the thing you're going to want to spend some cycles of your brain thinking about. Zerkova is probably the sleeper strong caster here. Her feat is absolutely devastating if used correctly. It just like flat out stops ranged attacks and like you lose your initials or something. I'll have to look at it again. It's gross. So just sort of prepare for what her feat could do. This is a good place if we have if you can use a defensive feat or have a way to play defensively so you can wait that out and not lose too much. As we go to Crix, we get Asphyxious 1, Scar 3, Iacos 2, and Gorshade 1. And they have Black Industries. And they, of course, then have Agathea. They have Black Industries and Scourge of the Broken Coast. I think they're going to lean heavily on Black Industries. That's sort of the popular go-to right now. However, the one real benefit is none of these casters are really helping the defensive profiles of those Warjacks. Gorshade, I think, can still give them stealth. Maybe. I'd have to go check. I do think these casters can still play strongly in those. But basically, I think you want to make sure you have a decent... In either case, you want to have a decent spell or melee presence into what list is brought. You could see plenty of guns. Scourge, especially for Scourge of the Broken Coast, you don't want to be relying on blast damage unless you can scalpel out the Sea Witch, and you don't want to rely on what do I want to say? You don't want to be relying on ranged attacks too heavily in either case, because Black Industries bringing Carapace Slayers is going to be pretty devastating. I would expect to see Carapace Slayers. Not a massive ton of debuffs here. I mean, obviously, Lich 1 will bring some of that with Parasite, but in general, I think this is not going to be, you don't have to plan for things like the Tenebras, for example. Okay. Oh, and I didn't talk about Agathea, who I think could play in either theme as well. Again, she's not bringing as much of the debuffs. Lich, I think, has a little bit more. He can swing armor by 5. But, yeah. As we move to Ret, they have Forges of War, Defenders of Bios. Now, they're going through a rework of their themes and a few little things a lot sooner. So I would say part of the way through the season, we're going to see those changes. I absolutely think Ron in Forges of War is extremely underrated. I think we don't really bring a ton of protection from magic, so you're going to want to play really cagey into those matchups. Assyria means, again, you want to try to not rely too terribly on your melee threat. Alara is going to have a longer melee threat. Vyros 2. So I would say Assyria, Vyros 2, Alara can play in either. They're going to still have access to Helena. She definitely would be in Forges, I think. I think Vyros is going to be in Forges. I think Ron will be in either. I think you'll see Helena in Forges, and I think you'll see Assyria or Alara in Defenders, which kind of has a lot of things in it as of right now, at least. So that said, I think Retjacks sort of play the same way they always have. I think if we can bring a decent melee threat, I don't think Assyria can kind of get around some of the stealth, but on her feet. But aside from that, as long as you're not overly reliant on ranged attacks and not overly reliant necessarily on charges and Ron, I think you'll be okay here. Convergence, they're bringing both of their themes, Destruction Initiative, Clockwork Legions. And then they've got Lucant, Aurora, and Orion. With Orion, don't rely on your upkeeps for defensive bonuses. You're going to see, I think any of the three of them can play in any of these two themes. People still seem pretty mopey about Aurora, so I would expect more Lucant, Orion. But I think there's strength in all of this. You're going to see a pretty decent, strong recursion engine with Aurora, or with whoever plays in Clockwork Legions. So you may want to think about that a little bit, or just have good answers to their Enigma Foundries, perhaps. Lucant's going to bring a lot of armor, be slow. Orion's going to bring a little more offense. Mercs, we have three themes: Lely's Resistance, the Kingmaker's Army, and Operating Theater. So the reason for this is they actually have 5 because they have a pretty big faction. But each caster can only play in one theme. So you've got Gaston 2 and Ashlyn in Lely's. You've got Magnus, I think that's 2? No, that's Magnus 1 and Damiano, who play in Kingmakers. And you've got Siphon, who plays in Operating Theater. And I think any pairing of the themes is going to be pretty compelling. I actually think Gaston is extremely underrated in his strength right now. But if you're bringing some of our stronger range protection, you'll be okay. I don't think he has RFP, so you're probably still okay with Morvana as well because of Sakmon. Ashland does have one of the cloud walls. Or actually, can you do that in either? They can, either of them in Lilies can have the cloud wall depending on which options they bring. Magnus 1 is sort of an oddball. Damiano is always strong, and I think Siphon is actually a pretty strong sweeper type list. As we go to Troll Bloods, we've got the Power of Dunia. We've got Storm of the North, so Northkin and the War Beasts, and then they've got Ragnar, and then Kalandra, Doomshaper 3. Yeah, that's 3. Gristle 2 and Borka 2. And I know already I've heard Banky talking about playing Gristle 2 in Storm of the North, so I would prepare for that. Basically, his idea is ambushing bears that can get pretty much wherever they want to go, and then bombers bombing. So a Kruger, our range protection, bombers don't bomb all that far, so if you have the ability to kind of control some of what's going on in the game, that might be fine. Borka 2 is going to present you with a pretty significant question with his battle group that you're going to need to think about. In my opinion, Borka 2 is better than Doomshaper 3 at doing this, and Kalandra's just strong. I think you could play her in either theme, so Trolls are going to be pretty strong. The only RFP they're really bringing is with their Warbeasts, so just keep that in mind. They don't have their RFP theme force, so that's good. And so yeah, this will require some thought. Any Grievous Wounds you bring is going to be really good for your Doomshaper matchup, so keep that in mind. We talked about Circle already. Scorn has Makeda 2, Jalam, I believe that's Hexerus 2, and Morgul 1, and then Zadesh, who nobody likes. Or, sorry, not Zadesh, Zakar. They have Imperial Warhost and Masters of War. One of those is their Warbeast theme. The other one is their infantry theme. I believe the infantry theme does allow them to... that's one that does RFP, so if you're leaning on Morvana, definitely think about your Scorn matchup quite a bit beforehand, because that might get pretty awkward. I don't think there's anything particularly scary. I think you're definitely going to want an answer to, and this is where if Morvana is one of the lists you're playing and you're definitely expecting Scorn, I think you're going to see Makeda Cats as one of the lists. And if you do, I think that's the theme that allows the RFP. Then you're going to want to have a plan for that. Either know how you can play Morvana into that with RFP being a factor, or plan to play your second list. But all these casters are pretty strong. I think Jalam, Makeda are probably the strongest. I think Morgul's actually much stronger than most Scorn is given credit for. And there's definitely some really interesting Zakar lists that I've seen, but not a ton of. For Legion, we've got Oracles and Primal Terrors, and then Animag, Veil 2, Thagrash 2, Lilith 1. I think you'll see Oracles with Veil or Thagrash. Primal Terrors with Animag. Krissa, I don't think you'll see. And then Lilith could kind of go either way. I think you'll see her in Oracles if you see her, though. Again, no real access to RFP, no to speak of. Thagrash has a little bit, but with no RFP, you have Grievous from Animag, but that's not a big deal for us. I think this could be another place to look at those factors when selecting your list. With Blindwater, we've got Barnabas 2, Sturman Drain, Jaga Jaga, and Dr. Arcadius, and they get Blindwater and will work for food. And in that case, I sort of expect that we're going to see... I'm not exactly sure what the list is going to look like. Neither of these casters are overly looking... So, Blindwater gives snacking to Gators, which is something that does bring RFP, so something to keep in mind. Barnabas is nigh unkillable, so you're going to want to come up with a really good solution to play around that. Dr. Arcadius is definitely considered very strong right now, and if there's a pigcaster, they're going to be in Work for Food. I think Sturm and Drang are underrated by their community right now. I think Jaga Jaga is also currently not really seeing a lot of play. She has a tremendous amount of output she can do. Not a lot of tricks, necessarily. But she can, if you're really reliant on like one piece, she can spot remove them pretty easily. So this will be an interesting one, and they're kind of on the rise. So definitely do not discount this theme or this list. And then, of course, we have Grimkin, and they have King, Child, and Old Witch in Dark Menagerie and Bump. King can play either. I think you see Old Witch in Bump and Child in Dark Menagerie. So, and that kind of rounds it out. So we'll talk a little bit more about specifics and lists and like how I've been playing stuff as time comes a little closer and evaluate then. But I think it's going to be really interesting. I think there's a lot of things to think about there. Hopefully I got your brain kind of moving. And yeah. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Like I said, I definitely have more thoughts, but I wanted to kind of go through what's going on there. I think we'll get into a little bit more specific. Like I'm hopefully going to approach list building, because if I've talked about Morvahn, I've talked about Kruger, like how those lists might change, or a way I may play Wormwood, right, or Kai 3. And I want to approach that and say, like, this list is for this environment. And because it doesn't make any sense to be talking about, like, oh, well, what are you going to do if you're faced off against Nemo 3? And I'm like, I'm playing this in Champions. That's never going to happen, So we'll look at that some more. We'll see how it goes. We'll see if there's any trends we start hearing. There's only been a couple rumblings so far with that. But in any case, that's going to be all for this episode. As always, if you enjoy the episode, share, like us, start in the conversation. And we'll talk to you next time.